This week we talk about Charles Darwin and natural selection. Very important cornerstones of science. Yesterday and today you read Chapter 6, Section 1, and worked on a worksheet and some notes. And so let's go over some of the high points of this. So first of all, just a couple little facts, a little kind of interesting facts. A naturalist, which is just to say somebody who studied nature. Back then, they didn't generally use the term ecologist or biologist like we do now. So this was in 1831, and as you saw on the Brain Pop yesterday, he was a very educated man. He had studied theology, religion, and medicine, so he had science. Um, but basically, the thing they didn't tell you, this kind of interesting little fact, his father wanted him, his father wanted him to, get a professional job and do these things. And I actually need to double check. His father wanted him to go into the priesthood, and he didn't want to do that. So he said, you know what? And he signs up for this job to be the naturalist on the HMS Beagle. HMS just stands for Her Majesty's Ship, which is what they call the ships in England. Here in the United States, it's USS. There was HMS. So the HMS Beagle. And he was just along for the ride, and his job was to document the different plants and animals everywhere they traveled. And he is most famous for his observations in the Galapagos Islands. However, you can see by this map, which is straight out of the book, the journey they took was really quite a long journey. They went a lot of places, which contributed to his big overall observations of many different things. So they started up here in Europe, and they go down here along the coast of Africa, through the Atlantic, South America, South America, South America, all over the place, around the islands here. And so all these little stops along the way. And then they arrive at the Galapagos Islands. Now, another little thing, kind of twist of fate that you don't always hear about, it turns out that Charles Darwin, he was enjoying his journey, sure, but he was also terribly, terribly seasick. Horribly seasick. So when he got to the Galapagos Islands, which are here, off the coast of what's now Ecuador, right near the equator, he said, we're going to be here for a while. I'm just going to stay on land. So he spent a lot of time on the islands, not on the ship, because he was tired of being seasick. The Galapagos Islands, if you imagine, either if you've ever been there or just pictures in your head of what Hawaii looks like, volcanic islands in the ocean, that's similar to what the Galapagos Islands look like and similar to how they formed. So they're isolated volcanic islands. Hawaii's right here. Not nearly as isolated as Hawaii, but they are isolated by, a couple hundred miles or whatever from South America. And that is where he did his most famous observations. Although at the time he was writing things down in his journal and drawing pictures and taking samples. Back in the day, since they didn't have a lot of, photography and recording like we do, they would actually take samples. They'd take birds and they would preserve them. And so there's, drawers of birds somewhere that he collected. Anyways, we'll look at his data in a few minutes. But they did that, spent some time there. And then here, Australia, around, and then back the tip of Africa, South America, and then back home. And when the observations he made, he did not immediately say, oh, this is amazing. But over the next several years, as he looked over his journals and the data he took, he came up with these ideas. So that's his journey. On the Galapagos Islands, some of the animals he looked at were the iguanas. Now, the iguanas were very different than the iguanas he'd seen on the mainland. And this is this pattern he saw. The animals were familiar, but different. A typical green iguana looks like this. These are found in South America. You saw how many times he stopped in South America. You also see these in Mexico. So common green iguana. In the Galapagos Islands, there are what we know now to be the only marine iguanas. Marine meaning they live in the salt water. And these iguanas, the picture in your book's a little easier to see, but they're bigger, And obvious difference is what color, right? This guy's green. What do you think he's camouflaging in? The trees and the jungle and the plants. These guys are blackish and gray and white. Guess where they live? Yeah, the volcanic beaches, black sand beaches, black volcanic rocks. They also have these very long claws. The common iguana has long claws for climbing trees. These guys have long claws for hanging onto rocks. And they have this marvelous adaptation where they eat seaweed. And they actually swim and dive in the water. They have to hold their breath, eat the seaweed, and then come back up. If you've ever watched any of the National Geographic or Nova or Planet Earth specials about the Galapagos Islands, you always see these iguanas because they're really fascinating. So anyways, this is the pattern he sees. An animal that's similar but seems to be different because of this area where it lives. And again, on Brain Pop, they call them mockingbirds. I've always heard them called finches. But here, again, a common small bird with very distinctively different beaks. And it turned out, as he observed these birds, and again, much like the Hawaiian Islands, there's a bunch of small islands here, not just one island. And the different islands are separated by ocean, of course, and have different resources, different plants. And so what he saw as he observed is that the birds that lived on the different islands that had different shaped beaks, and the different shaped beaks seemed to be correlated with things they were eating. So the more standard, regular looking beak, bird seed, that longer, thinner beak, he saw that these birds were kind of like woodpeckers, right? Getting the things out of the trees. And then the bigger, stronger beaks like this, eating nuts or fruits or stuff like that. Okay. So these were Darwin's observations. But what becomes really more important and why he's famous is the conclusions he made from this. Now this, as you can see, is from your textbook. Natural selection. So as we talked about yesterday, nature selecting or choosing, determining which traits are most useful. These are the 4 steps of natural selection. And you might want to write down the 4 steps and a tiny bit of detail, because this is something we'll see over and over as we talk about it. It's not just a guess. It's not just something that quickly happens, but these are the steps that make it happen. So the first thing in natural selection is overproduction. And so what that means, overproduction, in any given year, season, whatever, there are more animals, plants, whatever, born than can survive. So for example, you think about grasshoppers, thousands of grasshoppers born. The example in the book here has these baby turtles, or you can imagine fish, whatever you can think of, right? Rabbits. We've got lots of rabbits this past year or so because of lots of water, lots of plants, lots of rabbits. And so many more are born than can survive. And they're all going to have slight differences. And those slight differences are variations. Variations. And they might be really subtle variations. You'll look around this class, tons of variations. Everybody's hair is a slightly different color. Everybody's a slightly different height, as we saw in our little height chart last week. The rabbits, they all have slightly different fur colors. Some are fast, some are slow. Some have really good eyesight, some not so good, right? So variation. Each individual has slightly different traits due to just random mutations and sexual reproduction, getting some traits from mom and some traits from dad. You get that random mix-up, okay? All right. So then, step 1, overproduction. Step 2, variation. Step 3, competition and the struggle to survive. Now, this is the really important thing, because when we think about animals, we all like to think about our pets, right? But do our pets have competition in the struggle to survive? No. We feed them in a bowl a couple times a day. They have a house. They don't have to hunt. They don't have to run away from predators. So pets are awesome, but they're not a good example of evolution because they don't have to do this. But in the wild, The continuing with the grasshoppers. Grasshoppers in the wild would be eaten by birds or cats or lizards. They're run over by bicycles. They die from disease, insectified, starvations. So you don't know which grasshoppers. I mean, there's a desperate struggle to survive. These sea turtles here, they have to compete for food. They have to avoid predators. They have to have good enough senses to see what's going on around them. Rabbits need to avoid the coyotes and the cars driving on the road and find enough food to eat. So then finally what happens through the competition and struggle to survive is selection. We could also call that reproduction, because those that best adapted survive to reproduce and then pass on those traits. So overproduction, variation, competition, and then selection and reproduction. And that's how those best traits get passed on. And it could happen very slowly, little by little, or sometimes if there's a big change in the environment, the selection might change very quickly. So if there's a drought and there's hardly any food for the rabbits, then you're going to have a lot more of them die. The population might change a lot. Right now we have the opposite. A year ago we had a ton of moisture, lots of plants, tons of rabbits everywhere. And so in that way there might be a lot of competition just because there's so many of them. Okay, so that's that. The two words we're going to look at specifically tomorrow are variation. Those are the 4 steps again, just written out in one thing. And tomorrow we'll talk specifically about variation and adaptation. Variations are just differences. Adaptation is when that difference is useful for survival.